again. My name is Jeremy Myers. I am the Executive Director of the Christensen Center for Vocation, getting over a head cold, so hence the voice. This is another installation of the Uncovering Vocation series that we've been doing now for a year and a half here in Chapel. Our next one and the last one for the semester will be in 2 weeks on November 28th. Joanne Reek, our VP for Equity and Inclusion, will be speaking here in a couple weeks. Today, we have the opportunity to hear from Dr. Jennifer Diaz. Jennifer is a faculty member and chair of the education department. She's been a teacher for almost 20 years, but some people say, oh, I've always known I wanted to be a teacher. That's not Jennifer's story. So she has not always known that she wanted to be a teacher. So she's with us today to share some stories about how her vocational path was revealed for her life's work to actually become an educator, a math teacher, if you can believe that. It's hard for me to wrap my head around someone feeling called to teach math, but it happens. These stories that she'll share today will explore how we may not always know what is coming next, and sometimes in the midst of uncertainty, the world just might surprise you. So welcome, Dr. Jennifer Diaz.
Thanks, Jeremy, for the invitation to be here and the warm welcome. And thanks for being here to everyone else. Jeremy asked if I was nervous, and I said, no, not really. I mean, I talk in front of people as part of my work, but when you're preparing for something like this, you're like, well, there's always a chance that I'll be talking to an empty room. So thank you for giving me an audience. I'm going to share a couple of stories. And the first one happened about a month ago. One morning, we were just kind of getting ready for school. I was running around the house, trying to get everybody out the door. And sometimes my 3-year-old and my 5-year-old will find activities to do while I'm getting ready. And one of the activities that morning was coloring. And I came back down into the kitchen, and my 3-year-old, holding a red permanent marker in his hand, pointed to a circle that he had drawn on the back of our leather stool in the kitchen. And he said, I did not do that. I was like, okay. And I was kind of like, again, trying to get everybody out. And I told him, I said, we only draw on paper. Why did you do that? What were you thinking? And kind of after this repeated request for his rationale, he responded with some tears and apologies, but then also like a smirky little smile that told me that he was both sorry and not sorry. You know, he was sorry because he was caught, but he wasn't sorry that he did it. I don't ever think I'll know why he drew that circle, but probably in his head, he got the idea and he couldn't like not draw the red circle. And it was brave, and I think he knew it. And he definitely took a risk with his choice of media. And he just totally went for it. So I'm scrubbing it off as we're trying to leave, and I felt bad because I had, made him cry. And I told him, I said, that was a very beautiful circle, because they're working on it at school. And I said, next time, please draw it on paper. So I'm starting with this story because I think it captures a belief that I have that everyone and everything is a teacher. And so it's a funny story, it's playful for me now in hindsight. I can tell it while I'm laughing and smiling. But it's also a statement about how I try to understand what each moment is teaching me and what I am teaching others through my life and my work. So I've been called to be a professional educator, to study as part of my work the arts and the sciences of teaching and learning. And in this work, I have been a first grade teacher, a second grade teacher, a combination first and second grade teacher in multilingual classrooms, I've also been a teacher educator for almost 15 years. I told my students this morning that my first kids that I taught are now their age, graduated from university, and finding their path. And so as my vocation, I do this work on purpose and with intention. But as Jeremy mentioned, my story didn't start with, oh, I always knew. I was born to be a teacher. Part of this story involves dropping all of my classes the night before the drop deadline, self-advising, which I do not advise. Don't do that. But I had a giant, undergraduate catalog that I was thumbing through in the basement of my apartment. And I changed my major to elementary education through conversations with my roommates. They were my advisors. And so I was excited and I was anxious. I just didn't really know what I was doing or why. And then 3 years later, on the day I graduated, one of my former teacher educators gave me a card and it said, "Give your gifts freely to the world, expecting nothing in return. Someday, the world will surprise you." So I think my vocation story is about how I just came to listen and hear my calling through noticing what my gifts are and finding a way to freely give them to the world and being surprised. So the next 3 stories then just highlight some of the gifts that I think have come to me and then that I try to give through my work. So I have memories of a time in 3rd grade when my parents were encouraged to move me ahead to 4th grade. And I wasn't a part of all the conversations, but I knew that generally the focus of the conversation was what I had in school smarts, I lacked in social skills. So my parents were like, it's probably not a good idea. They wanted to set me up to be successful in one of those first lessons of schooling and how to be a friend. And I remember very, with an open heart, my first friends, and they all stood out in the crowd in some way. So one of my best friends, Maria, she was adopted, and that was an experience that most of my other friends hadn't lived through. Rochelle, one of my very close friends, was one of the very few students of color in the school that I grew up in. I had a good friend, Noah, and he was my friend in a class where our teacher kept a behavior chart with gold stars, literally, not a joke. And his just didn't line up with everyone else's. He was on the other end of where we were supposed to be, but he was a good friend of mine. And Jessie, I remember fondly. She spoke Japanese at home and English at school, and she would sometimes speak Japanese to her close friends. So I think they were among some of my first teachers. And I know they taught me to see one of my first gifts, which is acceptance. When I'm with others, I try and see people for who they are. And when people are with me, I want them to know that they can be their true whole self without judgment. So in my first year of teaching 2nd grade, the world brought me Aaron. And he had quite a few adventures in my classroom, including one in which he stood in front of me as I was giving a spelling test and very publicly and loudly declaring that he hated me. So instead of trying to fight against him, telling him to stop or making, a larger scene, and turning him into something that he couldn't be in that moment, I gave Aaron acceptance. And I think that probably surprised him and maybe came to him as, what appeared to be a lack of response. So he eventually did stop yelling while I gave the spelling test over him. And I've learned when giving acceptance that can often be difficult to establish and express boundaries because it seems like you'll just accept everything. And so as I've learned this, I had to think about, well, am I okay with someone yelling in my face that they hate me? As a general rule, I'm not. But Aaron and I talked about that later, and I advocated for myself, and I also advocated for him and learned what he needed. And throughout that first year of second grade for both of us, my students and I learned each other's boundaries, what's acceptable, and what needed to shift as we learned and grew with each other. So I think Aaron probably gave the most hugs that year. I didn't really believe that he hated me, but he also probably saw that I needed those hugs just as much as he did. So in any learning experience, there are growing pains. I learned a lot about growing up as the fourth child, wedged between 3 older, 2 younger brothers and sisters. So we had it all happening. In the midst of this chaos, I learned to see another one of my gifts as calm. My family jokes that we didn't need any pets because we had so many kids. But we did try and have a pet once, and her name was Casey, and she was a little Cocker Spaniel. We got her as a puppy. I don't know what my parents were thinking. But she ran away. And she, I think, was probably hunting for some peace and quiet. And like Casey, I did that a lot too as a kid. I looked for a calm escape. Like I would do art or read, or I remember packing up bags and like running away up the street and sitting under a tree for hours. And over time, I started to realize that I could bring calm back into spaces to provide different kinds of energy. So if I'm in a classroom, or if I'm at home with my 3 kids, a husband, a dog, a cat. My son is also lobbying for a fish, so we'll see. But I try to give calm as part of my presence. As a young teacher, I remember giving calm to Alex. For Alex, it just seemed like everything was difficult. Just being in school, everything was too loud, everything was too bright. But when he was writing poetry, everything came a little easier for him. And it wasn't something in our curriculum. We weren't supposed to do it, but it was a way that I could give calm. We could dim the lights, we could turn on some quiet music, and kids could write poetry. And I think that's where he became himself, kind of through this space of poetry where he could figure out who he was without so many of the rules of writing in school. So like acceptance, one of the dangers of calmness is it can be read as apathy or not caring. So where some people care by worrying about others, I give calm as a way to care about myself and other people. So I know there are tensions and stresses and contradictions that are a part of every life, but I don't try and fight them. So instead, with the gift of calm, I can kind of manage my expectations to know that I'm not always in control. I can plan, and I must be flexible. I can be excited and steady. I can be passionate and patient. I can be quiet and lead. So I find and I bring calm into the spaces between extremes. I was telling my class again the story this morning where we're living extremes right now. We have a 14-year-old daughter, and so there are lots of extremes. And I just told her last night, part of my role is to kind of help steady those extremes. Not all of my teachers have been people. I grew up in a place where I didn't have a choice about the form of religion that I grew up around. As a young child, of course, I followed my parents. I went along with the teachings and the rituals and the unspoken rules. But over time, I understood less and I questioned more. I argued with the logic and pushed back on some of what I interpreted as hypocrisy and injustice. My religious upbringing revealed for me another gift of curiosity. I've always loved school and learning. I think that's part of why I just kept going. When somebody was like, hey, do you want to do your master's? I was like, sure. School? Cool. Do you want to do your PhD? Sounds good. I have no idea what that means, but I get to keep going to class and talking to people about interesting things. And so that's one of the ways that I get to give and express my curiosity. And I know that I'm the kind of person that school was made for. I was set up to be successful in learning. So as a teacher in my first few years, I met Sydney, Emmanuel, Jabril, and Jared. And these 4 were among my hardest and most favorite. And that says something because I had a kid screaming at me that I hate you in front of me while I gave a spelling test. But they weren't difficult because of who they were. They were difficult because school was not set up for them to be successful. And as their teacher, I got to give them my curiosity and try to create new spaces where they could be seen as something other than kids who didn't care, kids who couldn't or didn't get it, or would just always be in trouble. Giving curiosity can often be read as being contrary. I'm okay with that. Just ask my husband. In fact, my parents always thought I would be a lawyer because of my ability to argue. So when I ask, well, why does it have to be that way? And somebody says, well, that's just the way it's always been done. I don't accept that as an answer, and I don't think that's good enough. And yet I know that curiosity is a privilege. So I consider it one of the most important gifts I've received and can give. And I must give it carefully so the consequences of my wonderings aren't destructive or harmful. As a teacher and teacher educator, I get to give acceptance, calm, and curiosity every day. And I've been surprised on the paths that I've taken. I've been able to take risks and make mistakes and trust that everything that happens in my life is teaching me something. Even a red circle and permanent marker, not on paper. Thank you for coming. As you're kind of sitting and listening to the music, maybe just try and think about what is one of your gifts that you've been given and that you also give. Thanks.